Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of history's most brutal and transformative conflicts. A war so devastating, it was called the War to End All Wars. World War I didn't just reshape maps or topple empires, it shattered an entire way of life, dragging the world kicking and screaming into the modern age. From the trenches of the Western Front to the collapse of ancient dynasties, this is the story of how a single gunshot in Sarajevo ignited a global inferno that would consume millions of lives and change everything forever. So settle in, maybe grab something warm to drink, and let's journey back to a time when the world stood on the precipice of unimaginable destruction. Before you get comfortable though, take a moment to like this video if you enjoy deep dives into history, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see our global community come together to explore the past. Now imagine Europe in 1914, a continent that had enjoyed relative peace for nearly a century, where royal families were connected by marriage, where trade flowed freely across borders, and where many believed that civilization had progressed too far for another major war. The optimists of the era genuinely thought that economic interdependence and diplomatic sophistication had made large-scale conflict obsolete. They couldn't have been more wrong. Beneath the surface of this Belle Epoque elegance, tension simmered like a pot left too long on the stove. Ancient hatreds, territorial ambitions, and a dangerous web of alliances had turned Europe into a powder keg waiting for a spark. The stage was set by decades of imperial rivalry and nationalist fervour. Great powers had spent years building massive armies and navies, each trying to outdo the others in a relentless arms race that consumed enormous resources and fed growing paranoia. Germany, unified only in 1871, was flexing its industrial muscles and demanding its place in the sun. France still smarted from its humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War and dreamed of reclaiming Alsace-Lorraine. Russia, the giant of the East, was modernizing rapidly, but remained plagued by internal strife and revolutionary rumblings. Austria-Hungary, that patchwork empire of competing ethnicities and languages, struggled to hold itself together as nationalist movements gained strength. And Britain, mistress of the seas and ruler of the largest empire in history, watched nervously as Germany's naval expansion threatened its maritime supremacy. These weren't just political disagreements settled over afternoon tea in diplomatic drawing rooms. These were existential struggles for survival, power, and national identity. Each nation had convinced itself that its enemies were plotting its destruction, that compromise meant weakness, that only strength could guarantee security. It was a mindset that made war not just possible, but almost inevitable. The alliance system that was supposed to preserve peace instead created a dangerous domino effect. The Triple Alliance bound Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy together, while the Triple Entente linked France, Russia, and Britain. What started as defensive agreements designed to deter aggression became a mechanism that would drag the entire continent into conflict. When one nation mobilized, its allies felt compelled to follow suit. When one empire declared war, others found themselves honor-bound to join the fight. It was a system that transformed a regional crisis into a global catastrophe. But the immediate cause of this massive conflagration was surprisingly small, almost absurd in its simplicity. On June 28, 1914, in the dusty streets of Sarajevo, a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots that would echo around the world for the next 4 years. His target was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, a man who ironically had been one of the more moderate voices in the empire, someone who might have reformed the system rather than destroyed it. Franz Ferdinand was visiting Sarajevo as part of a goodwill tour, an attempt to show the flag in this restless corner of the empire where Slavic nationalism was growing stronger by the day. Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary only 6 years earlier, and many of its Serbian inhabitants resented foreign rule. They dreamed of uniting with their ethnic brothers in the independent kingdom of Serbia, creating a greater South Slavic state. To them, the Archduke's visit was a provocation, a reminder of their subjugation. The assassination itself was almost comically bungled. The Black Hand, a secret Serbian terrorist organisation, had sent several young assassins to Sarajevo, armed with bombs and pistols. Their first attempt failed spectacularly when one conspirator threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, only to have it bounce off and explode behind the motorcade, injuring bystanders but leaving Franz Ferdinand unharmed. The assassination plot seemed to have failed, and the surviving conspirators scattered in panic. But fate, as it often does in history, intervened with cruel irony. Later that same day, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn while trying to visit the victims of the earlier bombing attempt. As the car reversed and turned around, it came to a stop directly in front of a delicatessen where Gavrilo Princip happened to be buying a sandwich. Finding himself face to face with his target at point-blank range, Princip drew his pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the neck. The second hit his pregnant wife Sophie in the abdomen. Both would be dead within minutes. In that moment, as the shots rang out across the cobblestones of Sarajevo, the old world began to die. What followed was a cascade of ultimatums, mobilizations, and declarations of war that would consume Europe in flames. Austria-Hungary, convinced that Serbia was behind the assassination, decided to crush its smaller neighbour once and for all. But Serbia had a protector in Russia, which couldn't abandon its Slavic brothers without losing face. Germany stood behind Austria-Hungary, while France was bound to support Russia. Britain initially hoped to stay out of the continental quarrel, but when Germany invaded Belgium to outflank the French, London felt compelled to honour its guarantee of Belgian neutrality. Within 6 weeks of the assassination, most of Europe was at war. What had started as a localised Balkan crisis had mushroomed into a continental catastrophe. The mobilisation orders went out, and millions of men began marching toward frontiers that would soon become graveyards. Enthusiastic crowds gathered in capital cities, cheering as their sons and fathers marched off to what everyone believed would be a short, glorious conflict. "Home before the leaves fall," they said in Germany. "Over by Christmas," echoed voices across Europe. They had no idea they were watching the beginning of 4 years of mechanised slaughter that would leave an entire generation buried in the mud of Flanders and the forests of the Eastern Front. The war that erupted in August 1914 was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Previous conflicts had been limited affairs, fought by professional armies with relatively primitive weapons. This would be something entirely different, an industrial war that consumed entire nations and their populations. The same technological advances that had brought prosperity and progress to the Belle Époque would now be turned to the business of killing on an unprecedented scale. Machine guns, artillery, poison gas, aircraft, submarines, all would play their part in a conflict that redefined the very nature of warfare. Germany's war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, called for a lightning strike through Belgium and northern France, encircling Paris and knocking France out of the war within 6 weeks. This would allow Germany to turn its full attention to Russia, which was expected to mobilise slowly due to its vast distances and primitive infrastructure. On paper, it looked brilliant. In practice, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that would doom Germany to fighting the very two-front war it had sought to avoid. The German advance through Belgium was swift and brutal, but it wasn't swift enough. Belgian resistance, though ultimately futile, slowed the German timetable by precious days. The British Expeditionary Force, though small, fought with professional skill that surprised German commanders. French forces, reeling from initial defeats, managed to regroup and counterattack. At the Battle of the Marne in September 1914, the French and British halted the German advance just short of Paris, forcing the Germans to retreat to more defensible positions along the Aisne River. What followed was the race to the sea, as both sides tried to outflank each other, extending their lines northward until they reached the English Channel. When the flanking movements failed, the armies dug in, creating a continuous line of trenches that would stretch from Switzerland to the North Sea. The war of movement that everyone had expected had become a war of position, a deadly stalemate that would last for nearly 4 years. Life in the trenches was a nightmare beyond imagination. Soldiers lived in muddy ditches carved from the earth, surrounded by barbed wire, under constant threat of sniper fire, artillery, bombardment, and poison gas attacks. The space between opposing trenches, known as no man's land, was a hellscape of shell craters, corpses, and rusted wire. Rats the size of cats fed on the dead, while lice and disease plagued the living. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of cordite, gas, decay, and human waste that clung to everything and everyone. Between these parallel lines of death, millions of men faced each other across distances that could sometimes be measured in yards. They could hear their enemies talking, laughing, coughing in the night. Yet when ordered to attack, they would climb out of their trenches and walk into machine gun fire that cut them down in waves. The weapons of the industrial age had made defence far stronger than offence, but the generals on both sides were slow to adapt their tactics to this new reality. The Eastern Front was different but no less brutal. Here, the vast distances of Poland and Russia allowed for more mobile warfare, but the scale of suffering was just as immense. Russian armies, poorly equipped and badly led, suffered catastrophic defeats at Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes, losing hundreds of thousands of men in just a few weeks. Yet Russia's greatest weapon was its seemingly inexhaustible supply of manpower. No matter how many men fell, more kept coming, wave after wave of peasant soldiers marching toward the guns. Austria-Hungary found itself fighting on multiple fronts, struggling against Russia in Galicia, Serbia in the Balkans, and eventually Italy along the Alpine frontier. The polyglot empire's army, composed of Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Croats, and dozens of other nationalities, began to fracture under the strain. Units refused orders, entire divisions surrendered en masse, and the dream of Austro-Hungarian greatness slowly crumbled in the mud and snow of the Eastern Front. The war at sea opened new dimensions of horror. Germany's submarine campaign targeted not just military vessels, but merchant ships, including passenger liners. The sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915, with the loss of over 1,100 civilian lives, including 128 Americans, shocked the world and began to turn neutral opinion against Germany. Britain's naval blockade of Germany, meanwhile, created widespread hunger and suffering among German civilians, including women and children who had no role in the conflict. Technology evolved rapidly as the war progressed. Aircraft, initially used for reconnaissance, became fighters and bombers. Poison gas, first deployed by the Germans at Ypres, spread to all armies despite international laws prohibiting its use. Tanks, developed by the British to break the trench deadlock, would eventually revolutionise warfare. Each new weapon brought the promise of ending the stalemate, but each was met with countermeasures that only added to the carnage. The war's appetite for men and materials was insatiable. Entire industries were converted to military production. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, replacing men who had gone to fight. Rationing became common as resources were diverted to the war effort. Governments borrowed enormous sums, mortgaging their nation's futures to pay for the present conflict. The economic foundations of the old order were cracking under the strain. As 1914 turned to 1915, then 1916, the initial enthusiasm for war gave way to grim determination, then to war-weary resignation. The lists of dead grew longer. The promises of quick victory rang hollow, and the true cost of industrial warfare became clear. This wasn't a brief adventure or a glorious crusade. It was a grinding war of attrition that would test every nation's will to continue fighting. Yet even as the war seemed to settle into an endless stalemate, the conflict was spreading like wildfire beyond Europe's borders. The Ottoman Empire, seeing an opportunity to reclaim lost territories and restore its fading glory, joined Germany and Austria-Hungary in late 1914. This decision would prove catastrophic for the Turks, opening new fronts across their vast territories and ultimately sealing the empire's doom. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 epitomised the war's talent for turning strategic brilliance into tactical disaster. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, conceived a bold plan to knock the Ottomans out of the war by forcing the Dardanelles Strait and capturing Constantinople. On paper, it was elegant. A successful naval assault would open a direct supply route to Russia, potentially bringing the war to a swift conclusion. Instead, it became another bloody stalemate, this time fought on the rugged cliffs and beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula. The landings began in April 1915, with British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces storming ashore under withering Turkish fire. The defenders, led by an unknown colonel named Mustafa Kemal, later known as Ataturk, fought with desperate courage from commanding positions overlooking the invasion beaches. What was supposed to be a quick breakthrough became an 8-month nightmare of trench warfare in a landscape even more hostile than the Western Front. Soldiers fought in temperatures that soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, plagued by dysentery, typhoid, and clouds of flies that fed on the thousands of unburied corpses rotting in the Mediterranean sun. Water was scarce, supplies irregular, and the Turkish positions seemed impregnable. Men died not just from bullets and shells, but from disease and heat exhaustion. The smell of death hung over the entire peninsula like a poisonous fog. Meanwhile, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, another British expedition was marching toward Baghdad, driven by dreams of oil and imperial expansion. The campaign began promisingly enough, with British and Indian forces advancing up the Tigris River, capturing Basra and pushing toward the ancient city of Baghdad. But the desert was an unforgiving enemy, and Turkish resistance proved far stronger than expected. At Ctesiphon, just outside Baghdad, the British advance ground to a halt. Forced to retreat to the town of Kut, an entire army found itself surrounded and besieged by Turkish forces. For 5 months, the garrison held out, eating rats and grass as supplies dwindled, while relief expeditions failed repeatedly to break through. When Kut finally surrendered in April 1916, it marked one of Britain's most humiliating defeats, with over 13,000 soldiers marching into Turkish captivity. The war in Africa raged across a continent where European powers had carved out vast colonial empires. German East Africa, under the brilliant leadership of Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, became the setting for a campaign that would last the entire war. With a force composed mainly of African askaris, von Lettow-Vorbeck tied down over 300,000 British, South African and Portuguese troops in a guerrilla campaign that ranged across modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique and Zambia. The African campaign was particularly cruel to the continent's indigenous populations. Hundreds of thousands of African porters were conscripted to carry supplies through jungle and desert, and many never returned home. Entire regions were stripped of food and resources to feed the war machine. Disease, famine, and displacement killed far more Africans than bullets ever did. Yet their sacrifice remains largely forgotten in the grand narrative of the Great War. Back in Europe, the year 1916 brought 2 battles that would come to symbolise the war's ultimate futility. At Verdun, the Germans launched a massive offensive designed not to break through French lines, but to bleed France white by attacking a position the French could not afford to lose. The ancient fortress city became a symbol of French resistance, and both sides fed division after division into the meat grinder of artillery fire and poison gas. For 10 months, the battle raged across a landscape transformed into something resembling the surface of an alien planet. Shell craters overlapped shell craters, forests were reduced to splinters, and the very soil was poisoned with lead and chemicals. French soldiers called it the Hell of Verdun, and with good reason. Men went mad from the constant bombardment, while others were buried alive when shells collapsed their dugouts. The French managed to hold, but at a cost that left the nation's army on the brink of mutiny. The British response came at the Somme, where Field Marshal Douglas Haig launched what he hoped would be the decisive offensive of the war. After a week-long artillery bombardment that could be heard across the English Channel, British forces went over the top on July 1st, 1916, in what became the single bloodiest day in British military history. Nearly 60,000 British casualties fell in a single day, many of them volunteers who had answered Kitchener's call to serve their country. The Somme offensive continued for months, with minimal gains measured in yards rather than miles. New tactics were tried, new weapons deployed, but the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Defensive positions strengthened by machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire were simply too strong for infantry attacks to overcome without massive casualties. The battle finally ended in November, with over 1 million casualties on all sides, and the front lines barely changed. As the slaughter on the Western Front reached new heights of absurdity, cracks began to appear in the facade of national unity that had sustained the war effort. In Russia, military disasters and economic collapse had brought the Tsarist regime to the brink of revolution. Food riots in Petrograd turned into a general uprising, and in March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar made the fatal decision to continue the war, despite the fact that Russian armies were disintegrating and the home front was collapsing. This decision would ultimately bring Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power, with consequences that would echo throughout the 20th century and beyond. France, meanwhile, was experiencing its own crisis of morale. The failed Nivelle offensive in 1917 had promised breakthrough and delivered only more casualties. Entire French divisions mutinied, refusing to attack but pledging to defend their positions. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as though France might collapse from within, leaving Germany free to concentrate all its forces against Britain and its allies. The entry of the United States into the war in April 1917 provided a crucial boost to Allied morale, but American forces would not arrive in significant numbers for many months. President Woodrow Wilson had tried to keep America neutral, but Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, which proposed a German-Mexican alliance against the United States, made neutrality impossible. America's industrial might began to tip the balance, but the war's outcome remained far from certain. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, bringing Britain dangerously close to starvation. On the Eastern Front, Russian resistance was crumbling, freeing up German divisions for transfer to the West. The race was now between American mobilization and German desperation. Technology continued to evolve at breakneck pace, driven by military necessity and human ingenuity. Aircraft developed from fragile reconnaissance platforms into sophisticated fighters and bombers. Pilots became the knights of the modern age, their aerial duels capturing public imagination in a way that trench warfare could not. Aces like Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, and Eddie Rickenbacker became household names, representing individual heroism in an increasingly mechanized conflict. Chemical warfare reached new levels of horror as both sides developed increasingly deadly gases. Chlorine gave way to phosgene, then to mustard gas, each more terrible than the last. Gas attacks created a special kind of terror, turning the very air into a weapon. Soldiers lived in constant fear of the gas alarm, knowing that a faulty mask or a moment's delay could mean an agonizing death. The war had also become a battle for hearts and minds, fought with propaganda as much as with bullets. Governments on all sides worked to maintain civilian morale while demonizing their enemies. Posters depicted the enemy as savage beasts, while carefully censored newspapers reported only victories and heroic sacrifices. The truth about conditions at the front was hidden from populations already stretched to their breaking point. Women found themselves thrust into roles they had never occupied before, working in munitions factories, driving trucks, and serving as nurses near the front lines. The war was breaking down traditional social barriers, even as it broke down nations and empires. The suffragette movement, temporarily suspended in Britain for the duration of the conflict, would emerge stronger than ever when peace finally came. Children grew up in a world where war was normal, where fathers and older brothers disappeared into the trenches never to return. An entire generation came of age knowing nothing but conflict, their childhood memories filled with rationing, air raids, and the constant fear that the telegram boy might bring news of another family tragedy. The global economy was being reshaped by the war's demands. Britain, France, and Russia borrowed enormous sums from American banks, while Germany and Austria-Hungary printed money to finance their war efforts. Inflation began to gnaw at the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, while war profiteers grew rich on government contracts. The old certainties of the gold standard and balanced budgets were giving way to the modern realities of deficit spending and managed currencies. Religion, too, was being tested by the war's horrors. How could a loving God permit such suffering? Military chaplains struggled to provide comfort to men facing death daily, while theologians grappled with the moral implications of industrial slaughter. Many soldiers lost their faith in the trenches, while others found it strengthened by proximity to death and the brotherhood of shared suffering. The war was reshaping not just Europe, but the entire world order. Old empires were cracking under the strain, while new nations were being born in the fire of conflict. The principle of self-determination, championed by President Wilson, was inspiring subject peoples from Ireland to India to demand their freedom. The world that would emerge from this conflict would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered it so confidently in 1914. As 1917 drew to a close, the war had settled into a pattern that seemed as permanent as the seasons themselves. Spring brought renewed offensives, summer saw the grinding battles of attrition, autumn witnessed the final desperate pushes before winter forced both sides into their dugouts and bunkers. Each year promised to be the last, yet each year ended with the same stalemate, the same rows of crosses in military cemeteries, the same hollow promises that victory was just one more offensive away. The Western Front had become a universe unto itself, complete with its own geography of death. Soldiers developed an intimate knowledge of places that existed nowhere on any peacetime map. Hill 60, Messines Ridge, Passchendaele, the Menin Road. These weren't just tactical objectives, they were landscapes of memory carved in blood and marked by the graves of friends. Men who had never travelled beyond their home villages before the war became experts in the topography of destruction, able to navigate by shell craters and the skeletons of blasted trees. Communication trenches snaked back from the front lines like arteries carrying the lifeblood of war. Ammunition, rations, fresh troops moving up, wounded men moving back, messages, supplies, all flowed through this network of muddy ditches that connected the fighting positions to the world behind. The trenches had names, often grimly humorous ones, chosen by the men who lived and died in them. Piccadilly Circus, Hellfire Corner, Dead Man's Road. Humour was one of the few weapons that remained effective against the horror. The routine of trench warfare had become as regular as a factory shift, which in many ways it resembled. Stand to at dawn, when attacks were most likely. Weapons inspection, cleaning rifles that would be dirty again within hours. Sentry duty, peering through periscopes at no man's land, watching for movement, for the glint of enemy equipment, for signs of an impending assault. Repair work, strengthening parapets damaged by the previous night's shelling, stringing new wire, deepening dugouts, and always, the waiting. Letter writing became an art form, practiced by millions of men who had never considered themselves writers. Censorship meant that descriptions of actual conditions were forbidden, so soldiers developed their own code, their own way of communicating the reality of their situation without triggering the censor's blue pencil. "We're having a bit of a rough time" might mean their unit had taken 70% casualties. "The weather's been rather unpleasant" could indicate a gas attack that had left men choking on their own blood. Packages from home took on enormous significance. A tin of biscuits, a pair of warm socks, a photograph. These small tokens of the world beyond the war became precious beyond measure. Men would share chocolate with comrades they barely knew, understanding that today's generosity might be repaid tomorrow when their own parcel failed to arrive. The postal service, remarkably, continued to function despite the chaos, delivering mail to men in the most forward trenches, maintaining that tenuous link between the world of war and the world of peace. The Christmas truce of 1914 had become legend, but such spontaneous fraternization became increasingly rare as the war dragged on. The high command on both sides actively discouraged any contact with the enemy, beyond that conducted with bullets and shells. Yet even in the depths of mechanized hatred, humanity occasionally flickered through. Wounded men were sometimes allowed to crawl back to their lines without being shot. Burial parties worked under informal truces. In quiet sectors, both sides might tacitly agree to avoid unnecessary casualties, understanding that their enemies were as weary and homesick as they were. Medical advances born of necessity revolutionized the treatment of battlefield wounds. Plastic surgery, developed to treat facial injuries caused by shrapnel, gave disfigured men hope of returning to society. Blood transfusion techniques saved thousands who would have died from blood loss. Prosthetic limbs became more sophisticated as the number of amputees grew. Yet for all these advances, far more men died than lived, and those who survived often bore invisible wounds that would haunt them for the rest of their days. Shell shock, as it was then called, became increasingly common as the war progressed. Men who had shown remarkable courage under fire would suddenly break, unable to function, trembling at the sound of a door slamming. The medical establishment struggled to understand this invisible injury, often treating it as cowardice or weakness. Some soldiers were court-martialed and shot for what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder. Others were subjected to primitive treatments that often did more harm than good. The home front experienced its own transformation as the war consumed ever greater resources. Rationing became a way of life in Germany, where the British naval blockade had reduced the population to near starvation. Bread made from sawdust and turnips became the norm. Children grew up stunted and malnourished. The elderly and weak simply died, victims of what Germans grimly called the turnip winter. Even in Britain and France, where conditions were better, civilians learned to do without luxuries they had once taken for granted. War bonds and patriotic campaigns urged citizens to sacrifice for the national cause. Scrap metal drives stripped railings from parks and cooking pots from kitchens. Victory gardens sprouted in backyards and public spaces as people grew their own food to supplement dwindling supplies. The very language of daily life became militarized. Civilians were urged to fight on the home front, to do their bit, to remember that every sacrifice brought victory closer. Propaganda reached new heights of sophistication and cynicism. Artists and writers were mobilized to serve the war effort, creating images and slogans designed to maintain morale and demonize the enemy. Atrocity stories, some true, many exaggerated or entirely fabricated, were used to justify the continuation of a conflict that had long since lost any rational purpose. The truth became the first casualty of a war that had claimed so many others. Women's roles in society were permanently altered by the demands of total war. They worked in munitions factories, handling dangerous chemicals and explosives. They drove trucks and buses, replaced men in offices and shops, served as nurses and auxiliaries near the front lines. The rigid social conventions of the pre-war era crumbled under the pressure of necessity. When the war ended, there would be no going back to the old restrictions and limitations. Children's games reflected the new reality of a world at war. They played at being soldiers, using stick rifles and wooden swords to recreate the battles they read about in heavily censored newspapers. Toy soldiers became more popular than ever, though the reality of what those toy figures represented was carefully hidden from young eyes. An entire generation grew up thinking war was normal, that fathers and brothers were supposed to disappear into something called the front. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 found populations weakened by years of privation and stress. The flu killed more people than the war itself, targeting particularly the young and healthy adults who had somehow survived the trenches and the factories. It was as if nature itself had joined the conflict, determined to finish what human folly had begun. Whole families were wiped out, entire villages left nearly empty. Technology continued its relentless advance, driven by the demands of an increasingly mechanized conflict. Trucks replaced horses for moving supplies, though millions of animals still served and died alongside their human companions. Radio communication allowed for better coordination of artillery fire, though the primitive equipment often failed at crucial moments. Aircraft evolved from wood and wire contraptions into sophisticated fighting machines capable of bombing cities hundreds of miles behind the lines. The tank, that mechanical monster born from the marriage of the automobile and the machine gun, promised to break the deadlock of trench warfare. Early models were slow, unreliable, and vulnerable, but they pointed toward a future where mobility and firepower would once again dominate the battlefield. Tank crews endured hellish conditions inside their steel boxes, breathing exhaust fumes and engine heat, while enemy bullets rang against their armour like deadly hail. Submarine warfare reached new levels of ruthlessness as both sides targeted civilian shipping. The U-boat campaign that brought America into the war continued with a mechanical efficiency, sending hundreds of merchant vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. Convoy systems eventually reduced the losses, but not before the submarine had proven itself as a weapon that could strangle nations by cutting their maritime lifelines. The war had spawned entirely new categories of weapons and tactics. Poison gas, despite being banned by international law, became routine. Flamethrowers turned men into human torches. Artillery barrages of unprecedented intensity pulverized entire landscapes. The machine gun, perfected in the decades before the war, proved to be the perfect defensive weapon, capable of mowing down attacking infantry like wheat before the scythe. Intelligence gathering became a science as both sides sought to penetrate enemy plans and intentions. Code breaking, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, all were refined and systematized. The romantic image of the spy gave way to the reality of bureaucratic intelligence organizations that processed vast amounts of information in their quest for military advantage. Morale became as important as ammunition in sustaining the war effort. Entertainers toured the trenches, bringing music and laughter to men who had almost forgotten such things existed. Military bands played stirring marches as troops moved up to the line, though the music often couldn't drown out the sound of distant artillery. Newspapers and magazines were carefully edited to maintain optimism, presenting each tactical withdrawal as a strategic repositioning and every limited advance as a great victory. The churches struggled to reconcile their message of peace and love with the reality of industrialized slaughter. Military chaplains performed the impossible task of comforting men about to die while blessing the weapons that would kill their enemies. Some found their faith strengthened by proximity to death and suffering, while others lost it entirely in the face of seemingly senseless carnage. Revolutionary ideas flourished in the chaos of collapsing empires. The Russian Revolution of 1917 sent shockwaves around the world, proving that Even the most autocratic regimes could fall when their people had endured enough. Communist agitators infiltrated armies and factories, preaching class war as an alternative to national war. The old order that had seemed so permanent in 1914 was cracking along fault lines no one had previously noticed. The map of Europe was being redrawn even as the fighting continued. New nations were emerging from the ruins of old empires. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia. These names represented the aspirations of peoples who had been subjects rather than citizens. The principle of national self-determination, championed by President Wilson, was reshaping the very concept of statehood and sovereignty. Economic systems strained under the unprecedented demands of total war. Governments borrowed against their nation's futures, mortgaging the next generation to pay for the current conflict. Inflation began to erode the purchasing power of ordinary citizens, while war profiteers accumulated vast fortunes. The gold standard, that bedrock of pre-war financial stability, was abandoned as nations printed money to fund their military efforts. Colonial empires found their foundations shaken by the demands of global war. Indian troops fought in France and Mesopotamia. African soldiers served in campaigns across their continent. Canadian and Australian forces proved themselves among the finest fighters on the Western Front. These contributions would not be forgotten when the war ended, and the demand for greater autonomy or outright independence would reshape the imperial world. Scientific research was mobilized for military purposes as never before. Chemists developed new explosives and poison gases. Physicists worked on improved artillery and communications equipment. Medical researchers sought ways to treat the new categories of wounds created by modern weapons. The war accelerated technological development by decades, though at a cost that made many wonder whether such progress was worth the price. The very concept of civilization was being tested by the unprecedented scale of destruction. How could nations that prided themselves on their culture and refinement engage in such systematic brutality? Writers and artists struggled to find meaning in the chaos, to create something beautiful from the raw material of horror. Some succeeded, producing works that would outlast the conflict that inspired them. Others were broken by what they witnessed, their creativity crushed by the weight of too much death. Military leadership evolved slowly, often tragically, behind the curve of technological change. Generals trained in the warfare of the 19th century struggled to adapt to the realities of the 20th. Some learned, developing new tactics and strategies that saved lives and achieved objectives. Others remained wedded to outdated concepts of honour and glory that sent millions to their deaths in futile charges against impregnable positions. The war had become a competition in industrial production as much as military prowess. Factories ran around the clock producing shells, rifles, aircraft, all the material necessities of modern warfare. Nations that had once competed in trade now competed in their capacity for destruction. The side that could produce the most weapons and keep them supplied with ammunition would eventually prevail, regardless of the courage or skill of individual sought to control, not soldiers. Censorship became total as governments just military information, but public opinion itself mouthpieces for official. Newspapers were reduced to M policy. Letters were opened and read by censors who deleted any information that might damage morale or aid the enemy. The truth became a luxury that nations at war could no longer afford, replaced by carefully crafted narratives designed to sustain the will to fight. The psychological toll of prolonged warfare began to manifest in ways that military planners had never anticipated. Entire units would break under the strain of continuous combat. Their effectiveness degraded not by enemy action, but by the accumulated stress of months or years in the trenches. Battle fatigue, as it was euphemistically called, became as much of a threat to military efficiency as enemy bullets. Winter brought its own special horrors, to the front lines. Frostbite claimed thousands of casualties who never saw an enemy soldier. Trench foot, caused by standing in cold water for extended periods, rotted away the extremities of men who had survived gas attacks and artillery barrages. The simple act of staying warm became a daily struggle that consumed enormous amounts of energy and resources. Supply lines stretched across continents as the war consumed raw materials from around the globe. Rubber from Southeast Asia, oil from the Middle East, grain from the Americas, all were sucked into the voracious maw of military production. The global economy was being restructured to serve the needs of warfare, with consequences that would outlast the conflict by decades. Peace negotiations became as complex as military campaigns, with diplomats manoeuvring for advantage even as soldiers died in the trenches. Secret treaties and private agreements carved up territories and populations like pieces on a chessboard. The war that had begun with such simple aims, the defeat of the enemy, was evolving into a struggle over the very nature of the post-war world. Cultural exchanges occurred even in the midst of total war. Soldiers learned phrases in enemy languages, picked up songs and stories from prisoners, absorbed techniques and technologies that would spread far beyond the battlefield. The war was paradoxically both destroying and creating connections between peoples who had been strangers before the conflict began. The role of women in warfare expanded beyond traditional nursing and support roles. Female spies operated behind enemy lines. Women pilots flew combat missions in Russia, and in many countries women took up arms in auxiliary forces. The war was breaking down gender barriers, as surely as it was breaking down national boundaries and social conventions. Religious and ethnic minorities found their loyalty questioned as nations struggled to maintain unity in the face of enormous casualties and hardships. German Americans were viewed with suspicion in the United States, while ethnic minorities in Austria-Hungary were suspected of disloyalty to the empire. The war was creating new categories of enemies and allies that crossed traditional lines of nationality and citizenship. The concept of total populations were mobilized for the war was becoming reality as entire conflict. There were no longer combatants and civilians, only different categories of war workers. Children collected scrap metal, elderly women knitted socks for soldiers. Farmers were told which crops to plant based on military needs. The distinction between the home front and the battlefront was disappearing. Food became a weapon as powerful as any gun or shell. The British blockade of Germany aimed to starve the Central Powers into submission, while German U-boats sought to cut Britain's maritime supply lines. Millions of civilians would die not from bullets, but from malnutrition and disease caused by wartime shortages. The war was being fought in kitchens and markets as much as in trenches and skies. Medical innovations born of military necessity would revolutionize civilian healthcare after the war. Blood banks, plastic surgery, prosthetics, physical therapy, all were advanced by the urgent needs of battlefield medicine. The war was simultaneously destroying and healing, creating new categories of injury, while developing new methods of treatment. The sound of the war became as distinctive as its visual imagery. The whistle of incoming shells, the rattle of machine gun fire, the drone of aircraft engines, these sounds would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. An entire generation learned to interpret the language of violence, to distinguish between friendly and enemy fire, to know by sound alone whether death was approaching. Time itself seemed to slow in the trenches, where days could pass without significant events and then explode into hours of frantic activity. Soldiers developed a different relationship with time, measuring their lives not in years or months, but in the intervals between attacks, between relief rotations, between letters from home. The future became an abstract concept, survival a matter of getting through the next few hours. Memory became fragmented for those who lived through the endless cycles of bombardment and assault. Men would remember the smallest details with crystal clarity. the exact pattern of mud on a dead comrade's uniform, the way morning light filtered through poison gas, the taste of water from a shell crater. Yet they might forget entire battles, whole weeks disappearing into a haze of exhaustion and trauma. The human mind, it seemed, could only process so much horror before it began to protect itself through selective amnesia. Artillery became the true king of the battlefield, consuming more resources and claiming more lives than any other weapon. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. A single heavy gun could fire shells worth more than most men would earn in a lifetime, sending projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds across distances that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. The sound of the guns became the war's constant soundtrack, a rolling thunder that never quite ceased, punctuated by the sharper cracks of rifle fire and the distinctive pop of gas shells bursting. Horses suffered alongside their human companions, millions of these noble animals perishing in a conflict for which they were utterly unprepared. They died from gas poisoning, artillery fire, exhaustion, and disease. Many were eaten when other food ran short. The sight of a dead horse, still harnessed to a shattered gun carriage or supply wagon, became one of the war's most poignant images. These creatures, who had served humanity faithfully for millennia, were among the war's most innocent victims. Weather became both ally and enemy to all sides. Rain turned battlefields into impassable swamps, while snow and ice made movement treacherous and supplies desperately scarce. The infamous mud of the Western Front wasn't just an inconvenience, but a genuine threat to life. Men drowned in shell holes, filled with liquid earth. Wounded soldiers sank beneath the surface and were lost forever. The very ground seemed to have turned against humanity, swallowing up the works of man as quickly as they could be built. Mail call became the most important moment in any soldier's day. Letters from home provided the only real connection to the world beyond the war, proof that somewhere life continued normally. Mothers wrote about gardens and grandchildren. Wives shared gossip from the neighbourhood. Sweethearts promised to wait however long it took. These fragile pieces of paper, often stained with mud and blood, carried more emotional weight than the heaviest artillery shell. Photography began to document warfare with unprecedented intimacy and horror. For the first time in human history, the reality of mass combat could be captured and preserved in stark black and white. Images of corpses tangled in barbed wire, of wounded men stumbling through poisoned landscapes, of entire cities reduced to rubble. These photographs would shape how future generations understood the true cost of modern warfare. Yet even the most graphic images could barely convey the full sensory assault of the trenches. Sleep became a luxury more precious than food. Men learned to doze standing up, to snatch moments of rest between bombardments, to sleep through explosions that would have terrified them in peacetime. Insomnia plagued those lucky enough to find safe beds, their minds unable to shut down after months of constant vigilance. Dreams, when they came, were often more terrifying than waking reality, filled with the faces of dead friends and the endless repetition of traumatic events. Language evolved to accommodate new realities that had never existed before. Words like shell shock, no man's land, and going over the top entered common usage. Soldiers developed their own slang, a gallows humour that helped them cope with the uncoping. Fritz and Tommy became generic names for German and British soldiers respectively, humanising enemies who were otherwise just targets in the distance. The vocabulary of death expanded exponentially, as new ways of dying required new terminology. Rats thrived in the carnage, growing fat on the abundance of corpses. These creatures, some reportedly as large as cats, became a constant presence in the trenches, scurrying over sleeping men and contaminating what little food was available. Yet even these loathsome scavengers served a purpose, providing early warning of gas attacks by their behaviour, and occasionally supplementing the meagre rations when other protein sources were unavailable. Music provided one of the few escapes from the horror of daily existence, Soldiers sang in the trenches, harmonizing melodies that could carry across no man's land to enemy positions. Popular songs from home mixed with improvised verses that captured the dark humour and desperate hope of men living on the edge of death. Military bands played when conditions permitted, their brass instruments offering moments of beauty in landscapes dedicated to destruction. Gambling became epidemic among soldiers who understood that tomorrow was never guaranteed. Cards, dice, and improvised betting games helped pass the long hours between battles while providing the illusion that luck might favour the living. Men would wager their rations, their cigarettes, their letters from home, anything that might bring a moment's excitement to lives otherwise dominated by fear and boredom. The irony was not lost on them that they were betting small stakes while playing the ultimate game of chance with their lives. Hygiene became a constant struggle against lice, fleas, and the general filth of trench warfare. Bathing was a rare luxury, often accomplished with cold water in shell craters or bombed buildings. Dental care was non-existent for most soldiers, leading to widespread tooth loss and gum disease. The simple act of staying clean became a matter of morale as much as health, a way of maintaining human dignity in dehumanizing circumstances. Uniforms evolved throughout the war as practical experience replaced pre-war military fashion. Bright colours and elaborate decorations gave way to drab earth tones and functional designs. Steel helmets replaced decorative headgear. Gas masks became standard equipment, and soldiers learned to modify their gear for maximum utility rather than appearance. The romantic image of the dashing officer in dress uniform was replaced by the reality of mud-caked men indistinguishable except by rank insignia. Engineering skills became as important as marksmanship in the new warfare. Soldiers learned to build and maintain the complex infrastructure of trench systems, to lay telephone lines under fire, to construct dugouts that could withstand artillery bombardment. The war created a generation of practical engineers who could solve problems with whatever materials were at hand, often improvising solutions that would impress professional architects. Cigarettes became more than a comfort. They were a currency, a social bond, and sometimes the difference between sanity and madness. Tobacco helped calm shattered nerves, provided an excuse for conversation between strangers, and gave men something to do with their hands during the endless waiting that characterised trench warfare. The distinctive smell of cigarette smoke mixed with cordite and decay became one of the war's defining aromas. Courage took many forms, from the obvious heroism of men charging into machine gun fire to the quiet bravery of medics crawling into no man's land to retrieve wounded comrades, chaplains who stayed with their men under bombardment, doctors who worked without sleep to save the wounded, supply troops who drove through artillery fire to bring food and ammunition, all displayed different aspects of the human capacity for selfless action under extreme stress. Breakdown and recovery became part of the rhythm of military life. Units would fight until they were no longer effective, then be withdrawn to rest areas where they could rebuild their strength and morale before returning to the line. These brief respites, often lasting only days, provided precious opportunities to write letters, receive mail, enjoy hot food, and pretend, however briefly, that life might someday return to normal. Artillery science advanced rapidly, as both sides sought more effective ways to deliver destruction across greater distances. Ballistics calculations became increasingly sophisticated, weather conditions were factored into firing solutions, and new types of shells were developed for specific purposes. High explosive rounds for destroying fortifications, shrapnel for killing personnel, gas shells for area denial, each had its place in the gunner's deadly arsenal. Camouflage emerged as both an art and a science, with entire units dedicated to concealing military positions from aerial observation. Artists were recruited to design deceptive patterns and false structures that could fool enemy reconnaissance. Trees were constructed from steel and canvas to hide observation posts, fake tanks were built to confuse enemy intelligence, and soldiers learned to move and fight while remaining invisible from above. Communication systems struggled to keep pace with the demands of modern warfare. Telephone lines were constantly cut by artillery fire, forcing reliance on runners who often died carrying messages between positions. Signal flags, carrier pigeons, and even dogs were pressed into service when more modern methods failed. The simple task of coordinating military actions across extended battle lines proved to be one of the war's most persistent challenges. Logistics became as complex as strategy, as armies learned to supply millions of men with everything from bullets to bandages across hundreds of miles of contested territory. Railways were extended almost to the front lines. Roads were built and rebuilt under constant bombardment, and vast supply depots were established to feed the insatiable appetite of modern warfare. The success or failure of offensive operations often depended more on the efficiency of supply trains than the courage of assault troops. Prisoners of war found themselves in a strange limbo, removed from the immediate danger of combat, but facing new challenges of hunger, disease, and psychological pressure. Camps varied widely in their treatment of captives, some maintaining reasonable standards, while others became centres of deliberate cruelty. The Geneva Convention provided some protection, but enforcement was often impossible in the chaos of total war. Intelligence gathering became a specialised profession, as both sides sought to penetrate enemy plans and capabilities. Aerial photography revealed troop movements and fortification construction. Radio intercepts provided glimpses into enemy communications, and prisoner interrogation yielded tactical information. Code breaking evolved from an amateur pursuit into a scientific discipline that would influence the outcome of major battles. Night fighting developed its own techniques and terrors as combat continued around the clock. Soldiers learned to navigate by sound and touch, to distinguish friendly from enemy movement in total darkness, to fight battles where muzzle flashes were the primary source of illumination. Night raids became common, small unit actions designed to capture prisoners, destroy specific targets, or simply keep the enemy off balance and sleepless. Medical evacuation systems evolved to handle the unprecedented volume of casualties generated by modern weapons. Stretcher bearers worked under fire to retrieve the wounded. Field hospitals operated within range of enemy artillery, and hospital trains carried the injured to safety hundreds of miles behind the lines. The chain of medical care, from battlefield first aid to specialist treatment, became a crucial factor in military effectiveness. Morale fluctuated wildly, based on factors that had nothing to do with military success or failure. A hot meal could restore hope to a demoralised unit, while bad news from home might break the spirit of previously reliable soldiers. Military commanders learned to pay attention to seemingly minor details like mail delivery and food quality, understanding that armies fought as much with their hearts as with their weapons. Training methods adapted to prepare men for the unique challenges of trench warfare. Recruits learned to use gas masks, to advance under artillery fire, to fight in close quarters with bayonets and grenades. Mock trenches were constructed behind the lines where new soldiers could practice the deadly skills they would need at the front. Yet no amount of training could fully prepare men for the psychological shock of their first exposure to modern combat. Wounds became categorized in ways that reflected the new realities of mechanized warfare. Shell fragments created jagged injuries, unlike anything doctors had previously encountered. Gas poisoning damaged lungs and nervous systems in novel ways, and machine gun bullets produced wounds that challenged existing medical knowledge. Military surgeons became innovators by necessity, developing new techniques to save lives that would have been lost in any previous conflict. Religion provided comfort to some, while abandoning others in their darkest hours. Military chaplains struggled to reconcile Christian teachings of love and forgiveness with the daily reality of organised killing. Some soldiers found their faith strengthened by proximity to death, while others lost all belief in divine justice or mercy. Churches at home grappled with how to support their nation's war efforts while maintaining their moral authority. Leave became the most precious reward available to soldiers, brief escapes from the horror that allowed men to remember who they had been before the war transformed them. Those lucky enough to return home for a few days often found themselves strangers in familiar places, unable to explain their experiences to loved ones who had no frame of reference for such suffering. The gap between combatants and civilians grew wider with each passing month. Discipline maintained military effectiveness, even as traditional authority structures crumbled under the stress of prolonged combat. Courts-martial dealt harshly with desertion and cowardice, yet also recognised that some men simply reached the breaking point after months of continuous stress. The line between legitimate medical conditions and punishable offences became increasingly difficult to define as understanding of psychological trauma slowly evolved. Innovation flourished as necessity forced rapid development of new weapons and tactics. Flamethrowers, hand grenades, trench mortars, submachine guns, all were perfected during the conflict and would influence military thinking for decades to come. The war became a laboratory for testing the limits of human ingenuity when applied to the problem of killing other humans more efficiently. Photography and film began to document warfare with unprecedented detail, creating visual records that would shape public understanding of combat for generations. Yet censorship ensured that the most horrific images never reached civilian audiences, maintaining the fiction that war retained some element of glory and honour, despite the industrial-scale slaughter occurring daily on multiple fronts. Propaganda evolved into a sophisticated science designed to maintain public support for increasingly unpopular policies. Governments learned to manipulate information, to present defeats as victories, to transform individual tragedies into national inspirations. The truth became not just a casualty of war, but an active enemy to be defeated through careful management of public opinion. Transportation systems groaned under the unprecedented demands of moving millions of men and vast quantities of supplies across continental distances. Railways became military assets as important as artillery, their capacity determining the scale and duration of offensive operations. Roads were built, destroyed, and rebuilt in endless cycles as the geography of war shifted with each season's campaigns. Weather forecasting gained new importance as military operations became increasingly dependent on atmospheric conditions. Wind direction determined the effectiveness of gas attacks. Rain could halt major offensives by making movement impossible, and temperature affected everything from weapon performance to soldier endurance. Meteorologists found themselves essential members of military planning staffs. Standardization of equipment became crucial as the war's scale made individual craftsmanship impossible. Millions of rifles, shells, and uniforms had to be produced to identical specifications, leading to mass production techniques that would revolutionize industry long after the conflict ended. The war was teaching humanity how to manufacture death on an unprecedented scale, while inadvertently laying the groundwork for peacetime prosperity. Psychology emerged as a field of study partly due to the war's impact on human behaviour. Military psychiatrists struggled to understand and treat the various forms of mental breakdown that combat produced, while researchers began to explore the limits of human endurance under extreme stress. The war was conducting a vast experiment on the human psyche, with results that would influence medical practice for decades. International law struggled to keep pace with the changing nature of warfare. Existing treaties governing conduct in war had been written for conflicts between professional armies, not for total wars involving entire populations. New categories of war crimes were being committed daily, yet the legal frameworks for addressing them would not emerge until after the fighting ended. Reconstruction efforts began even as the destruction continued, with engineers and planners designing the cities and infrastructure that would replace what the war had destroyed. The conflict was simultaneously tearing down the old world and forcing consideration of what would replace it. Every destroyed building, every abandoned farm, every shattered life represented both an ending and a potential new beginning. Time zones became militarily significant as coordination across vast fronts required precise timing of operations. The war was teaching humanity to think in global terms, to coordinate activities across continents, to understand that events in one location could have immediate consequences thousands of miles away. The world was becoming smaller, even as the war made it seem impossibly vast and chaotic. Revolutionary technology emerged from the crucible of warfare as inventors and engineers raced to create weapons that could break the deadly stalemate. The tank, that lumbering mechanical beast, represented humanity's attempt to marry the mobility of cavalry with the protection of a fortress. Early models were death traps as much as weapons, their crews cooking in steel ovens while struggling to navigate terrain that seemed designed to swallow anything heavier than a horse. Yet these primitive machines pointed toward a future where mobility and firepower would once again dominate battlefields that had become graveyards for traditional military thinking. Aircraft evolved from curious contraptions used for reconnaissance into sophisticated killing machines that brought war to the skies. Pilots became the new knights of the industrial age, their aerial duels capturing imaginations starved for individual heroism in a conflict dominated by anonymous mass destruction. The Red Baron, Billy Bishop, Eddie Rickenbacker, these names blazed across newspaper headlines, while millions of infantrymen died unremembered in the mud below. Yet even aviation, that most romantic of military pursuits, could not escape the war's grinding logic of attrition and technological escalation. Chemical warfare represented perhaps the most sinister innovation of the conflict, turning the very air into a weapon. Chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, each new compound brought fresh horrors to men who had thought they had already experienced the worst that human ingenuity could devise. Gas attacks created a special category of terror, forcing soldiers to live behind masks that transformed them into insect-like creatures, while reducing the world to a narrow field of vision and muffled sounds. The psychological impact often exceeded the physical damage, as entire units would panic at the first hint of chemical attack. Communication networks struggled to function across battlefields where traditional methods failed catastrophically. Telephone lines, strung with desperate hope across no man's land, lasted only hours before artillery fire severed the connections. Radio equipment, primitive and unreliable, offered tantalizing glimpses of coordinated warfare while failing at crucial moments when lives hung in the balance. Runners, those brave men who carried messages between positions, died by the thousands, their bodies marking the paths of military communications like a trail of breadcrumbs leading nowhere. Naval warfare expanded beyond traditional concepts of fleet actions to embrace entirely new forms of combat beneath the waves. German U-boats prowled shipping lanes like mechanical sharks, their commanders wrestling with the moral implications of sinking vessels filled with civilians while knowing that industrial warfare demanded the destruction of enemy resources regardless of their human cargo. The submarine campaign brought war to previously safe waters, making every voyage a gamble with death and transforming the world's oceans into contested battlegrounds. Medical science advanced by necessity as doctors confronted wounds that no previous generation of healers had encountered. Plastic surgery developed to repair faces destroyed by high explosive shells. Blood transfusion techniques saved men who would have bled to death in earlier conflicts, and prosthetics evolved to restore mobility to the thousands who left limbs scattered across European battlefields. Yet for every life saved by medical innovation, dozens more were lost to the war's insatiable appetite for human sacrifice. Shell shock emerged as a new category of injury that challenged everything military medicine thought it understood about courage and cowardice. Men who had shown remarkable bravery under fire would suddenly break, trembling at sounds that reminded them of artillery bombardment, unable to function in situations that should have posed no threat. The medical establishment struggled to comprehend these invisible wounds, often treating psychological trauma as moral failure rather than legitimate injury. Logistics networks expanded to support armies of unprecedented size, operating across distances that would have challenged previous military planners. Railway systems were militarized, their capacity determining the scale of offensive operations, while truck convoys began supplementing horse-drawn transport in the endless task of feeding the war machine. Supply officers became as crucial as combat commanders, their calculations determining whether attacks would succeed or fail based purely on the availability of ammunition and provisions. Civilian populations found themselves drawn into the conflict as never before, their factories converted to munitions production, their farms reorganized to feed armies, their children educated in schools where military drill replaced traditional subjects. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant blurred as entire societies mobilized for total war. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, replacing men who had marched away to fight, fundamentally altering social structures that had remained unchanged for centuries. Propaganda evolved from simple patriotic appeals to sophisticated psychological warfare designed to maintain morale while demonizing the enemy. Governments learned to manipulate information with scientific precision, presenting military disasters as strategic victories while transforming individual tragedies into national inspiration. The truth became not just a casualty of war, but an active threat to be managed through careful control of public opinion. Economic systems strained under demands that exceeded anything previous conflicts had required. National debts soared as governments borrowed against their country's futures to pay for present destruction. Inflation began eroding the purchasing power of ordinary citizens while war profiteers accumulated fortunes from government contracts. The gold standard, that bedrock of pre-war financial stability, cracked under pressure from economies dedicated entirely to the production and consumption of military materials. Intelligence gathering evolved from amateur espionage to professional military science, as both sides sought to penetrate enemy plans and capabilities. Code breaking became a specialized discipline that would influence major battles, while aerial reconnaissance provided unprecedented views of enemy positions and movements. The ancient art of spying was transformed by modern technology into a bureaucratic enterprise that processed vast quantities of information in search of tactical advantage. Revolutionary ideologies flourished in the chaos of collapsing empires and failed governments. Lenin's return to Russia in a sealed train provided by the German government represented one of history's most successful intelligence operations. As the Bolshevik leader's promise to withdraw Russia from the war served German strategic interests while advancing his own revolutionary agenda. The old certainties of monarchy and empire were crumbling under the weight of military failure and popular discontent. Colonial empires found their foundations shaken as the demands of global war exposed the contradictions inherent in imperial rule. Indian troops fought in European trenches, while their homeland remained under foreign control. African soldiers died for European causes, while their continent was carved up by the same powers they served. And Dominion forces from Canada and Australia proved themselves equal to any European army, while their countries remained constitutional dependencies. Religious faith was tested by suffering on a scale that challenged traditional concepts of divine justice and mercy. Military chaplains struggled to provide comfort to men facing daily encounters with death, while theologians grappled with how to reconcile Christian teachings of love and forgiveness with the reality of industrialized killing. Many soldiers lost their faith in the trenches, while others found it strengthened by proximity to death and the brotherhood of shared suffering. Cultural life adapted to wartime conditions as artists, writers, and musicians sought to find meaning in the chaos of modern conflict. Some created works that glorified military service and national sacrifice, while others began to question the very foundations of civilization that had produced such systematic destruction. The war was simultaneously destroying and creating culture, tearing down old certainties while forcing the creation of new forms of expression adequate to unprecedented experiences. Scientific research was mobilized for military purposes as governments recognized that technological superiority might determine the conflict's outcome. Chemists developed new explosives and poison gases, physicists improved artillery and communication equipment, and engineers designed weapons that pushed the boundaries of what was technically possible. The war accelerated scientific development by decades while directing human ingenuity toward the perfection of destruction rather than creation. Educational systems were transformed to serve military needs as schools became training grounds for future soldiers and munitions workers. Children learned to identify aircraft silhouettes, practiced gas mask drills, and participated in scrap metal drives that stripped their communities of anything that might serve the war effort. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but conflict, their childhood games reflecting the militarization of society. International law struggled to address the unprecedented scale of destruction and the new forms of warfare that existing treaties had never contemplated. The laws of war, written for conflict between professional armies, proved inadequate for total wars involving entire populations. New categories of war crimes were being committed daily, yet the legal frameworks for addressing them would not emerge until long after the fighting ended. Photography and film began documenting warfare with unprecedented intimacy, creating visual records that would shape public understanding of combat for generations. Yet censorship ensured that the most horrific images never reached civilian audiences, maintaining the fiction that war retained elements of honour and glory despite the industrial-scale slaughter occurring on multiple fronts. The gap between official representation and battlefield reality grew wider with each passing month. Transportation systems evolved to meet the demands of moving millions of men and vast quantities of supplies across continental distances. Railways became military assets as important as artillery, their capacity determining the scale and duration of offensive operations. Roads were built, destroyed, and rebuilt in endless cycles as the geography of war shifted with each season's campaigns. Weather forecasting gained new military significance as operations became increasingly dependent on atmospheric conditions. Wind direction determined the effectiveness of gas attacks. Rain could halt major offensives by making movement impossible, and temperature affected everything from weapon performance to soldier endurance. Meteorologists found themselves essential members of military planning staffs, their predictions influencing decisions that affected millions of lives. Food became a weapon as powerful as any artillery piece, with naval blockades designed to starve entire populations into submission. The British blockade of Germany created widespread malnutrition and disease among civilians, including women and children who had no direct role in the conflict. German submarine warfare responded in kind, targeting merchant vessels carrying food to Allied nations. Millions of non-combatants would die not from bullets, but from hunger and disease caused by wartime shortages. Time itself seemed to distort under the pressure of continuous combat, with soldiers developing different relationships with past, present, and future. Days could pass without significant events, then explode into hours of frantic activity that compressed lifetimes of experience into moments of terror and confusion. Memory became fragmented as human minds struggled to process experiences that exceeded normal psychological capacity. Music provided one of the few escapes from the horror of daily existence, with soldiers singing in trenches that carried melodies across no man's land to enemy positions. Popular songs from home mixed with improvised verses that captured the dark humour and desperate hope of men living on the edge of death. Military bands played when conditions permitted, their instruments offering moments of beauty in landscapes dedicated to destruction. Standardization of equipment became crucial as the war's scale made individual craftsmanship impossible. Millions of rifles, shells and uniforms had to be manufactured to identical specifications, leading to mass production techniques that would revolutionize industry long after the conflict ended. The war was teaching humanity how to manufacture death on an unprecedented scale, while inadvertently laying the groundwork for modern industrial methods. Camouflage emerged as both art and science, with entire units dedicated to concealing military positions from aerial observation. Artists were recruited to design deceptive patterns and false structures that could fool enemy reconnaissance, while soldiers learned to move and fight while remaining invisible from above. The war was creating new forms of visual deception that would influence everything from fashion to urban planning in the decades that followed. Engineering skills became as important as marksmanship in the new warfare, with soldiers learning to build and maintain the complex infrastructure of trench systems while under fire. The conflict created a generation of practical problem solvers who could improvise solutions using whatever materials were available, often achieving results that would impress professional architects and engineers. Night fighting developed its own techniques and terrors as combat continued around the clock, with soldiers learning to navigate by sound and touch while distinguishing friendly from enemy movement in total darkness. Night raids became common, small unit actions designed to capture prisoners, destroy specific targets, or simply keep the enemy off balance and sleepless. Medical evacuation systems evolved to handle the unprecedented volume of casualties generated by modern weapons, with stretcher bearers working under fire to retrieve the wounded, while field hospitals operated within range of enemy artillery. The chain of medical care, from battlefield first aid to specialist treatment, became a crucial factor in military effectiveness and soldier morale. Innovation flourished as necessity forced rapid development of new weapons and tactics that would influence military thinking for decades. Flamethrowers, hand grenades, trench mortars, and submachine guns were perfected during the conflict, while tactical innovations like infiltration attacks and rolling barrages began to offer hope for breaking the deadlock of trench warfare. Discipline maintained military effectiveness even as traditional authority structures crumbled under the stress of prolonged combat, with courts martial dealing harshly with desertion and cowardice, while slowly recognizing that some men simply reached psychological breaking points after months of continuous stress. The line between legitimate medical conditions and punishable offences became increasingly difficult to define. International cooperation emerged paradoxically from the chaos of global conflict, as allied nations learned to coordinate military operations across vast distances while sharing resources and intelligence in ways that would have been impossible during peacetime. The war was simultaneously destroying the old international order while creating new forms of cooperation that would outlast the conflict itself. Revolutionary changes in women's roles accelerated as the demands of total war shattered traditional social barriers and expectations. Women worked in munitions factories handling dangerous chemicals, drove trucks and buses, served as nurses near the front lines, and took on responsibilities that had been exclusively male preserves just years earlier. The rigid social conventions of the pre-war era were crumbling under the pressure of military necessity. Psychological warfare began to emerge as commanders recognized that breaking enemy morale might be more effective than destroying enemy positions. Propaganda shells carried leaflets encouraging desertion. Loudspeakers broadcast demoralizing messages across no man's land. And intelligence operations sought to spread rumors and disinformation that would undermine enemy resolve. Colonial troops brought new tactical knowledge and fighting skills to European battlefields, while simultaneously gaining military experience that would prove valuable in future struggles for independence. The war was inadvertently training the very forces that would eventually challenge imperial rule, as soldiers from India, Africa, and other colonies learned modern warfare techniques while serving the empires that controlled their homelands. Aviation technology advanced with breathtaking speed as the demands of aerial combat drove rapid innovation in aircraft design, engine performance, and pilot training. What had begun as simple reconnaissance flights evolved into complex air operations involving fighters, bombers, and specialized aircraft for artillery spotting, photography, and communication relay. Chemical defense became as important as chemical offense, with gas mask technology improving constantly as new threats emerged. Soldiers lived in constant fear of gas attacks while learning to fight effectively while wearing protective equipment that severely limited their vision and breathing. The development of chemical weapons created an arms race in protective gear that would continue long after the war ended. Recruitment methods evolved from voluntary enlistment to conscription, as casualty rates exceeded anything military planners had anticipated. Democratic governments found themselves forced to adopt authoritarian measures to maintain adequate manpower levels, while society struggled to balance military needs with economic requirements for industrial production. The war's global reach extended far beyond European battlefields, as fighting erupted in Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific, with colonial territories becoming pawns in a conflict that had begun with a single assassination in Sarajevo. Local populations found themselves drawn into a war they had not chosen, fighting for causes they barely understood, while serving masters who viewed them as expendable resources. Financial systems adapted to support war expenditures that dwarfed any previous military spending in human history. War bonds became popular investments, while rationing and price controls attempted to manage economies dedicated entirely to military production. The relationship between government and private industry was fundamentally altered as state direction replaced market mechanisms in determining production priorities. Urban planning began to incorporate lessons learned from aerial bombardment and artillery attack, with city designers considering defensive requirements alongside traditional concerns about commerce and transportation. The war was forcing humanity to think about how to protect civilian populations from military technologies that could strike far behind traditional battle lines. Social hierarchies shifted under the pressure of military service that brought together men from all classes and backgrounds in the shared misery of trench warfare. Traditional deference to social superiors crumbled when survival depended on competence rather than breeding, while the shared experience of combat created new bonds that transcended pre-war social divisions. Entertainment adapted to wartime conditions as performers toured military camps and hospitals, bringing music, comedy, and theatrical productions to men starved for diversion from the horror of daily existence. The entertainment industry learned to serve military morale while avoiding topics that might undermine the war effort or reveal uncomfortable truths about battlefield conditions. Agricultural production was reorganized to meet wartime needs, as farmers were told which crops to plant based on military requirements rather than market demand. Food rationing became common in belligerent nations, while neutral countries profited from increased demand for their agricultural exports. The war was reshaping global food production and distribution systems in ways that would outlast the conflict. Religious institutions struggled to maintain their moral authority while supporting national war efforts that seemed to contradict basic teachings about peace and human dignity. Churches, mosques, and synagogues found themselves blessing weapons and praying for military victory while trying to provide comfort to families devastated by war losses. Educational curricula were modified to support military recruitment and war production, with schools teaching technical skills needed for munitions manufacturing while promoting patriotic values that would sustain public support for continued fighting. An entire generation received their education in institutions dedicated to preparing them for a world permanently at war. The conflict's technological legacy would extend far beyond military applications, as innovations driven by wartime necessity found peacetime uses that revolutionized civilian life. Radio communication, aviation, chemical production, and mass manufacturing techniques developed for military purposes would transform peacetime society in ways that few participants could have imagined while struggling to survive in the trenches. As 1917 drew to a close, the war had fundamentally transformed not just the nations fighting it, but the very nature of human civilization itself. What had begun as a traditional European conflict had evolved into something entirely unprecedented in human history. A total war that engaged entire societies in the business of systematic destruction while simultaneously forcing rapid social, technological, and cultural evolution. The old certainties that had guided human behaviour for centuries lay shattered in the mud of the Western Front, while new forms of organisation, technology, and social relations emerged from the chaos of modern warfare. The world that would emerge from this conflict would be unrecognisable to those who had confidently marched off to war in the summer of 1914, believing they would be home before the leaves fell. Yet even as the war seemed to have settled into an endless pattern of attack and counter-attack, of advance and retreat, of death and more death, forces were gathering that would finally break the stalemate and bring this unprecedented conflict to its bloody conclusion. The entry of the United States, the collapse of Russia, and the final desperate gambles of exhausted European powers would combine to create a climactic year that would determine not just the war's outcome, but the shape of the 20th century itself. The year 1918 opened with Germany facing a cruel paradox that would define the conflict's final phase. After nearly 4 years of grinding warfare, the Central Powers found themselves simultaneously stronger and weaker than they had ever been. The collapse of Russia had freed up hundreds of thousands of German troops from the Eastern Front, creating the largest concentration of forces on the Western Front since the war's opening moves. Yet this apparent strength masked a deeper weakness that would prove fatal. The German home front was crumbling under the weight of the British naval blockade. The infamous turnip winter had given way to an even more desperate spring, with civilians subsisting on bread made from sawdust and potato peelings. Children grew up stunted and malnourished, their bodies bearing the permanent marks of wartime deprivation. In the factories, workers collapsed at their machines from exhaustion and hunger, while strikes and labour unrest spread despite harsh government suppression. The German army itself, while numerically stronger, was a shadow of the force that had nearly captured Paris in 1914. Veterans spoke of divisions filled with boys too young to shave and men too old to march, led by officers who had learned their trade in the charnel house of the trenches. Equipment shortages meant that many units went into battle with rifles that jammed and artillery shells that failed to explode. The vaunted German war machine was running on fumes, sustained only by the desperate hope that one final offensive might break the Allied will to continue fighting. General Erich Ludendorff, the man who had effectively become Germany's military dictator, understood that time was running out. American troops were arriving in France by the hundreds of thousands, bringing with them fresh enthusiasm and industrial resources that dwarfed anything the exhausted European powers could muster. If Germany was to avoid inevitable defeat, it had to act quickly, before the Americans could fully deploy their overwhelming advantages in men and material. The plan Ludendorff conceived was audacious in its scope and desperate in its motivation. Operation Michael, named after Germany's patron saint, would concentrate nearly 1 million German soldiers against a narrow front held by British forces. Using new infiltration tactics developed by stormtrooper units, the Germans would punch through Allied lines and advance rapidly toward the Channel ports, cutting British supply lines and potentially forcing Britain out of the war. The offensive began on March 21, 1918, with an artillery bombardment that surpassed anything the war had yet witnessed. For 5 hours, over 10,000 German guns poured shells into British positions, creating a man-made earthquake that could be felt hundreds of miles away. The bombardment mixed high explosive rounds with gas shells, creating a toxic fog that turned the battlefield into a vision of hell itself. When the German infantry emerged from their trenches, they advanced not in the traditional waves that had been slaughtered so many times before, but in small flexible groups that infiltrated weak points and bypassed strong positions. These stormtroopers, elite units trained in new tactics, moved like ghosts through the morning mist, appearing suddenly in British rear areas and creating panic among defenders who had grown accustomed to the predictable rhythms of trench warfare. The initial German advance was spectacular, gaining more ground in a single day than either side had captured in years of previous fighting. British lines crumbled as defenders, stunned by the ferocity of the bombardment and confused by the new German tactics, fell back in disorder. Towns that had been secure in German hands since 1914 suddenly found themselves threatened by advancing German spearheads. Yet even as German forces pushed forward, the fundamental problems that had plagued them throughout the war remained unchanged. Supply lines stretched thin as advancing troops outpaced their logistical support, leaving frontline units without adequate food, ammunition, or medical supplies. Communications broke down as rapid movement made it impossible to maintain telephone connections, while radio equipment proved too unreliable for coordinating complex operations. More critically, the German army lacked the reserves necessary to exploit their initial success. Every available soldier had been committed to the opening assault, leaving no fresh troops to push through gaps in Allied lines or to defend against inevitable counterattacks. The German advance, initially so promising, began to slow as exhausted troops encountered stiffening resistance from Allied forces that had recovered from their initial shock. The human cost of Operation Michael was staggering even by the war's brutal standards. German casualties mounted at rates that exceeded anything the army could sustain, while British forces, despite their tactical defeats, maintained their cohesion and fighting spirit. The offensive that was supposed to end the war quickly became another exercise in mutual destruction, consuming men and resources that neither side could afford to lose. As the German advance ground to a halt, Ludendorff launched a series of follow-up offensives, each one promising to achieve what its predecessor had failed to accomplish. Operation Georgette targeted British forces in Flanders, while Operation Blücher struck at French positions along the Aisne River. Each attack achieved initial success, pushing Allied forces back and capturing significant amounts of territory, yet none delivered the decisive victory that Germany desperately needed. The pattern was always the same. German stormtroopers would break through Allied lines, advancing rapidly in the first hours or days of the offensive. Allied forces would fall back, sometimes in panic, abandoning positions they had held for years. German newspapers would trumpet great victories, while Allied leaders wondered if their lines could hold. Then inevitably, the advance would slow as German forces outran their supplies, encountered fresh Allied reserves, or simply exhausted themselves in the effort of maintaining rapid movement across devastated terrain. By summer 1918, it was clear that Germany's great gamble had failed. The spring offensives had gained impressive amounts of territory, pushing Allied forces back dozens of miles in some sectors, yet they had not achieved their strategic objective of forcing the Allies to seek peace. Instead, they had consumed the last of Germany's reserves, while the steady stream of American reinforcements continued to tip the balance inexorably against the Central Powers. The arrival of American forces in significant numbers marked a turning point not just in military terms, but in the war's fundamental character. These fresh troops, many of whom had never seen combat, brought an enthusiasm and optimism that contrasted sharply with the war-weary resignation of European forces. They also brought American industrial might in the form of weapons, vehicles, and supplies that seemed limitless compared to the increasingly desperate shortages plaguing German forces. General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, insisted that American troops fight as independent units rather than being fed piecemeal into British and French formations. This decision, controversial at the time, would prove crucial in maintaining American morale and effectiveness. American soldiers entered combat with their own leaders, their own tactics, and their own distinctive culture of warfare that emphasized aggressive action over the defensive mindset that had dominated European thinking for years. The first major American offensive at Château Thierry in June 1918 demonstrated that these fresh troops could fight effectively against seasoned German veterans. American Marines, attacking with a ferocity that surprised both their enemies and their allies, pushed German forces back from positions they had held since their spring advances. The psychological impact of this success extended far beyond its tactical significance, proving that German forces were no longer invincible and that the tide of war was finally turning. As summer progressed, the initiative shifted decisively to the Allies. French forces, reinforced and re-equipped, began launching counterattacks that exploited German weaknesses. British troops, having absorbed the lessons of the spring defeats, developed new tactics that combined traditional British defensive tenacity with innovative offensive techniques borrowed from German stormtrooper methods. The Second Battle of the Marne in July 1918 marks the beginning of Germany's final retreat. What had been planned as another German offensive quickly turned into a rout as Allied forces, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, smashed through German positions that had seemed impregnable just months earlier. The psychological impact of this defeat rippled through German ranks, as soldiers who had endured years of hardship began to question whether continued resistance was possible or worthwhile. Technology played an increasingly decisive role as the war entered its final phase. Allied forces had finally learned to coordinate infantry, artillery, tanks and aircraft in combined operations that overwhelmed German defensive positions. The tank, once an unreliable curiosity, had evolved into a weapon system capable of breaking through fortified lines and exploiting gaps in enemy defences. Aircraft, no longer limited to reconnaissance and individual combat, began operating in large formations that could dominate entire sectors of the battlefield. Communication systems, too, had improved dramatically since the war's early years. Radio equipment, while still primitive by later standards, allowed for better coordination between different units and weapons systems. Artillery fire could be directed more precisely, infantry advances could be supported more effectively, and commanders could maintain better control over rapidly evolving battlefield situations. The German response to these technological disadvantages was increasingly desperate. New weapons like the Paris gun, a massive artillery piece capable of shelling the French capital from distances of over 70 miles, represented impressive engineering achievements, but had little strategic impact. Similarly, German development of jet aircraft and guided missiles, while technically innovative, came too late and in too small quantities to affect the war's outcome. More significant was the collapse of German morale as the reality of military defeat became undeniable. Soldiers who had endured years of hardship and sacrifice began to question the purpose of continued fighting when victory seemed impossible and the cost in human suffering continued to mount. Desertion rates climbed steadily as men chose survival over duty, while units that had once been reliable began to show signs of mutinous behaviour. The German home front, meanwhile, was experiencing its own form of collapse. Food riots broke out in major cities as the naval blockade tightened its grip on civilian populations. Industrial production declined as workers lacked the nutrition necessary to maintain productivity, while transportation systems broke down under the strain of moving military supplies while civilian needs went unmet. Political opposition to the war grew stronger as military defeats made it impossible to maintain the fiction that Germany was winning. Socialist politicians who had supported the war effort in 1914 began calling for immediate peace negotiations, while more radical voices demanded the overthrow of the government that had led Germany into this catastrophe. The situation in Austria-Hungary was even more desperate than in Germany. The polyglot empire, always held together more by imperial tradition than popular loyalty, began to fracture along ethnic lines as military defeats exposed the artificial nature of Habsburg rule. Czech, Polish, and Yugoslav nationalist movements gained strength as imperial authority weakened, while Hungarian leaders began to consider separate peace negotiations that would abandon their German allies. Italian forces, reinforced by British and French units, launched offensives that finally broke through Austrian positions that had held firm for years. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto in October 1918 shattered what remained of Austrian military effectiveness, leading to a complete collapse that left hundreds of thousands of Austrian soldiers as prisoners, while their empire dissolved into its constituent ethnic components. The Ottoman Empire faced similar disintegration as Arab nationalist movements, supported by British intelligence operations, launched revolts that severed Turkish control over vast territories in the Middle East. T.E. Lawrence, the legendary Lawrence of Arabia, helped coordinate these uprisings, while British and Commonwealth forces advanced from Egypt into Palestine and Mesopotamia, capturing Jerusalem and Baghdad in campaigns that finally achieved the objectives that had eluded them for years. Turkish resistance, once fierce and effective, crumbled as resources were diverted to defend the empire's heartland in Anatolia. The young Turk government that had brought the empire into the war faced growing opposition from military leaders who recognized that continued fighting would result only in the complete destruction of what remained of Ottoman power. In Germany, the naval mutiny at Kiel in late October 1918 sparked revolutionary uprisings that spread rapidly across the country. Sailors who had spent years inactive in port while their comrades died in the trenches refused orders to launch a final suicidal naval offensive against the British fleet. Their rebellion quickly spread to soldiers and workers who had similarly grown tired of sacrificing for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man whose imperial ambitions had helped trigger the conflict, found himself increasingly isolated as even his most loyal supporters recognized that his continued rule would make peace negotiations impossible. Military leaders who had once sworn absolute loyalty began to distance themselves from a regime that had lost all credibility with the German people. The situation reached a critical point in early November when revolutionary councils began taking control of major German cities. The government that had wielded absolute power just months earlier found itself unable to maintain order in its own capital as competing political factions struggled for control of a nation that seemed to be disintegrating. General Ludendorff, the architect of Germany's final military gamble, suffered a nervous breakdown as the full scope of his failure became apparent. The man who had effectively ruled Germany during the war's final years was no longer capable of rational decision-making, leaving the country without effective military or political leadership at the moment when such leadership was most desperately needed. The German army, meanwhile, was melting away as soldiers abandoned their positions and headed home to families they had not seen for years. Units that had maintained discipline through the war's worst horrors began to disintegrate as news of revolution spread through the ranks. Officers found themselves unable to maintain control over men who no longer saw any reason to continue fighting. Allied forces advancing on all fronts encountered less and less resistance, as German defensive positions were abandoned or surrendered without a fight. Towns and cities that had been under German occupation for years were liberated by advancing troops who sometimes found themselves welcomed as liberators by populations that had grown tired of wartime hardships. The race was now between military collapse and political revolution, as Germany struggled to maintain enough coherence to negotiate an end to the fighting before complete chaos engulfed the country. The government that remained nominally in control faced the impossible task of ending a war while managing a revolution, satisfying Allied demands while maintaining domestic order, and preserving some semblance of national dignity while accepting the reality of total defeat. On November 9th, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated his throne and fled to the Netherlands, ending 4 years of imperial rule that had brought Germany to the brink of total destruction. The German Republic that replaced his government would have just 2 days to negotiate an end to the fighting before the armistice took effect, bringing to a close the most devastating conflict in human history up to that point. The terms of the armistice, negotiated in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne, were harsh but not as severe as they might have been given Germany's complete military collapse. German forces would withdraw from all occupied territories, surrender vast quantities of military equipment, and accept Allied occupation of the Rhineland. The naval blockade would continue until a final peace treaty was signed, ensuring that Germany remained under Allied control during the transition to peace. As the guns fell silent at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, soldiers on both sides of the Western Front emerged cautiously from their trenches, many unable to believe that the killing had finally stopped. The silence that followed years of constant bombardment seemed almost supernatural, broken only by the sounds of men crying, laughing, or simply standing in stunned disbelief that they had survived. The statistics of destruction defied comprehension. Over 17 million people had died, including more than 10 million military personnel and 7 million civilians. Entire regions of Europe lay in ruins, their cities destroyed and their countryside poisoned by years of chemical warfare. The economic cost exceeded anything in human experience, with nations bankrupted by the effort of destroying each other. Yet even as the immediate fighting ended, the war's consequences continued to unfold in ways that would shape the remainder of the 20th century. 4 great empires had collapsed, creating a power vacuum that would be filled by new nations, new ideologies, and new conflicts. The Russian Revolution had produced the world's first communist state, while defeated Germany seethed with resentment that would eventually produce an even more terrible war. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 killed more people than the war itself, targeting particularly the young adults who had somehow survived the trenches. It was as if the war had weakened humanity's immune system, leaving entire populations vulnerable to diseases that might have been contained in peacetime. The social changes unleashed by the war proved as revolutionary as its military consequences. Women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, racial minorities had served in integrated military units, and traditional class distinctions had broken down under the pressure of shared sacrifice. The rigid social hierarchy of 1914 was gone forever, replaced by a more fluid society where merit and circumstance mattered more than birth and breeding. Technology developed during the conflict would reshape civilian life in ways that few could have imagined while struggling to survive in the trenches. Aviation would shrink the world, radio would create global communication networks, and industrial techniques perfected for military production would usher in an age of consumer abundance for those fortunate enough to live in the war's victorious nations. The psychological impact of the war would linger for generations, aided in normal human comprehension, and survivors struggled to make sense of experiences that exceeded entire generation had been educated in the school of industrial warfare, learning lessons about human nature and technological progress that would influence their approach to politics, economics, and international relations for the rest of their lives. Literature and art would be transformed by the need to express experiences that traditional forms seemed inadequate to capture. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon had begun this work even before the war ended, creating new language for describing the reality of mechanized death. Their efforts would be continued by novelists, filmmakers, and artists who sought to help humanity understand what it had done to itself. The peace conference that would convene in Paris in 1919 faced the impossible task of creating a stable international order from the ruins of the old system. The men who gathered there carried with them not only the hopes of their nations, but the traumatic memories of a conflict that had demonstrated both the best and worst aspects of human nature. President Woodrow Wilson arrived in Paris with his 14 points, a blueprint for a new world order based on democracy, self-determination, and international cooperation. His vision of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars seemed idealistic to European leaders who had learned to think in terms of power and self-interest. Yet it represented humanity's desperate hope that the war to end all wars had actually accomplished that impossible goal. The reality of peacemaking would prove as complex and frustrating as the conduct of the war itself. Competing national interests, ethnic hatreds, economic necessities and personal ambitions would all play their part in shaping treaties that satisfied no one completely, while creating new problems that would plague international relations for decades to come. Germany, excluded from the peace negotiations, would be forced to accept terms that many Germans considered unjustly harsh. The Treaty of Versailles would saddle the defeated nation with enormous reparations payments while stripping it of territory and military capabilities. These terms, designed to prevent German aggression, would instead create resentments that demagogues would exploit in their rise to power. The new nations created from the ruins of the German, Austrian, Russian, and Ottoman empires would struggle to establish stable governments while managing ethnic minorities who found themselves citizens of countries they had not chosen. Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, and other successor states would face the challenge of building national unity from diverse populations who had little in common beyond their former imperial rulers. The Middle East would be carved up according to British and French interests rather than local wishes, creating artificial boundaries that ignored tribal, religious, and cultural realities. The mandate system would replace direct imperial rule with international supervision that often differed little from the old colonial arrangements, storing up resentments that would explode into conflicts throughout the rest of the century. Russia, now the Soviet Union, would be excluded from the peace settlement despite its enormous sacrifices during the war. The Bolshevik government that had signed a separate peace with Germany found itself isolated diplomatically while fighting a civil war that would claim millions more lives. The communist experiment that emerged from Russian defeat would become an alternative to capitalist democracy that would challenge the international order for the next 7 decades. The United States, having played a decisive role in the war's outcome, would retreat into isolationism rather than accept the international responsibilities that its new power implied. The Senate's rejection of the League of Nations would leave the international organization without its most powerful potential member, undermining its effectiveness from the beginning. Britain and France, the war's nominal victors, would find themselves weakened rather than strengthened by their triumph. Both nations had mortgaged their futures to pay for victory, while their empires faced growing challenges from nationalist movements that had been inspired by wartime rhetoric about self-determination and democracy. The economic consequences of the war would prove as destabilizing as its political effects. The gold standard that had provided financial stability before 1914 could not be restored, while the enormous debts accumulated during the fighting would burden national budgets for decades. Inflation and unemployment would plague the post-war economy, creating conditions that would contribute to political extremism and social unrest. The war had demonstrated both humanity's capacity for heroism and its talent for destruction on scales previously unimaginable. Men had shown remarkable courage under impossible conditions, while simultaneously developing weapons and tactics of unprecedented lethality. The same species that had produced the Christmas truce had also created poison gas and strategic bombing. As the world attempted to return to normalcy in the war's immediate aftermath, it became clear that there could be no real return to the old ways. Too much had changed, too many had died, and too many assumptions about progress and civilization had been shattered for society to simply resume where it had left off in 1914. The generation that had survived the trenches would carry their experiences into positions of leadership in politics, business, and culture, shaping the interwar period with memories of what they had endured and witnessed. Their children, born into a world where total war was a demonstrated possibility rather than a theoretical nightmare, would grow up with different assumptions about human nature and international relations. The technological revolution unleashed by wartime necessity would continue to accelerate, driven now by commercial rather than military competition. The same innovative spirit that had produced tanks and poison gas would create automobiles, radios, and eventually television, transforming daily life in ways that peacetime development might have taken decades to achieve. Medical advances born of battlefield necessity would save millions of lives in civilian hospitals, while psychological understanding, developed through treating shell shock, would lay the groundwork for modern psychiatry. The war's medical legacy would prove to be one of its few unambiguously positive consequences. Educational systems would struggle to incorporate the war's lessons, while avoiding the trauma that direct discussion of the conflict often produced. How could teachers explain to children what their parents and grandparents had experienced without destroying their faith in human progress and civilization? The war's cultural impact would continue to unfold for decades as artists and writers processed experiences that had exceeded the capacity of traditional forms to express. New movements in literature, painting, music, and theatre would emerge from the attempt to make sense of industrialized destruction and mass death. Religious institutions would face the ongoing challenge of maintaining faith and hope in a world that had demonstrated humanity's capacity for systematic evil. How could traditional teachings about divine providence and human dignity survive the knowledge of what had happened in the trenches and gas chambers of the Western Front? The international system that emerged from the Paris Peace Conference would prove inadequate to prevent the rise of new threats to world order. Within 2 decades, many of the same nations would be fighting an even more destructive conflict that would make the Great War seem almost limited by comparison. Yet for all its failures and tragic consequences, the First World War had also demonstrated humanity's resilience and capacity for renewal. Societies that had seemed on the verge of complete collapse had somehow found the strength to rebuild and continue. The same species that had created the horrors of trench warfare had also shown remarkable courage, compassion, and creativity under the most extreme conditions imaginable. As the survivors of the Great War attempted to build a better world from its ruins, they carried with them both the trauma of what they had experienced and the hope that such suffering might somehow serve a purpose. Their efforts would be imperfect, often failing to achieve the idealistic goals they had set for themselves, but they would continue the human struggle to create meaning from chaos and hope from despair. The story of the First World War was ending, but its consequences would continue to unfold throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The world that emerged from the conflict would be unrecognisable to those who had confidently marched off to war in 1914, transformed by an experience that had tested the very limits of human endurance and ingenuity. The men who returned from the trenches brought with them invisible wounds that would take decades to understand and even longer to heal. They came back to parades and celebrations, to grateful nations eager to forget the horror and embrace the myth of glorious victory. Yet behind their eyes lay memories that no amount of cheering could erase. The smell of poison gas lingering in morning fog, the sound of shells whistling overhead in the darkness, the faces of friends who had fallen beside them in the mud of no man's land. These veterans found themselves strangers in their own homes, unable to explain experiences that civilian minds could barely comprehend. How do you tell your wife about watching your best friend die from a machine gun burst? How do you describe to your children the way poison gas turned strong men into gasping, blind creatures crawling through their own vomit? The gap between those who had served and those who had waited at home would never fully close, creating a generation of men who shared secrets too terrible for ordinary conversation. Many turned to alcohol, that ancient remedy for unbearable memories. Others threw themselves into work with desperate intensity, as if constant activity could drown out the voices of the dead that whispered in quiet moments. Some simply withdrew, becoming silent figures in their own families, present in body but absent in spirit, their minds still trapped in trenches that existed now only in memory. The lucky ones found ways to channel their trauma into something constructive. They became teachers, determined to ensure that future generations understood the true cost of war. They entered politics, driven by the conviction that the suffering they had witnessed must never be repeated. They wrote books, painted pictures, composed music that tried to capture the reality of mechanized death and industrial-scale destruction. Yet even these efforts felt inadequate to the magnitude of what they had experienced. How could words describe the moment when artillery fire lifted the earth itself and flung it skyward in deadly fountains? How could paint capture the colour of a gas attack at dawn, the sickly yellow-green cloud that drifted across no man's land? Like death made visible, the traditional forms of human expression seemed too small, too limited for the task of communicating such unprecedented horror. The families of the dead faced their own struggles with memory and meaning. Gold stars appeared in windows across Europe and America, marking homes where sons, fathers, and brothers would never return. These symbols became shrines to sacrifice, but they could not fill the emptiness left by vanished laughter, unfinished conversations, and dreams that would never be realized. Mothers who had sent boys rapidly, their faces marked off to war, found themselves aging not just by time, but by grief that had no end. They kept bedrooms unchanged, preserving spaces for children who existed now only in photographs and fading letters. Some found comfort in the belief that their sacrifice had served a greater purpose, that their sons had died to make the world safe for democracy. Others simply endured day after day, carrying burdens too heavy for human shoulders. The economic reconstruction that followed the armistice proved almost as challenging as the war itself. Entire regions of France and Belgium lay in ruins, their cities reduced to rubble, their farmland poisoned by years of chemical bombardment. Roads had been destroyed, railways torn up, and industrial facilities either demolished by retreating armies or worn out by years of overuse. The task of rebuilding seemed overwhelming. How do you restore a cathedral that has been reduced to a pile of stones? How do you replant forests where trees have been turned to splinters by artillery fire? How do you clean soil that has been saturated with the blood of millions and contaminated with every chemical weapon that human ingenuity could devise? Yet slowly, painfully, the work began. French and Belgian farmers returned to fields that had been battlegrounds, clearing away unexploded shells and barbed wire, filling in shell craters, and attempting to coax life from Earth that had known only death for 4 long years. Many of these shells would remain buried, creating dangers that would persist for generations. Even today, a century later, farmers in the old battle zones occasionally die when their ploughs strike ordnance from the Great War. Cities rose from their own ashes through the determined efforts of people who refused to let destruction have the final word. New buildings incorporated lessons learned from aerial bombardment and artillery attack, while urban planners tried to create communities that would be more resilient to future conflicts. The scars remained visible for decades, patches of newer construction marking where shells had fallen or fires had raged, but life gradually reasserted itself in places where death had seemed triumphant. The human cost of reconstruction was enormous. Widows took on jobs that had previously been reserved for men, supporting families while grieving husbands they would never see again. Children grew up without fathers, learning independence earlier than any child should, while carrying the weight of family expectations that had once been shared by two parents. Communities that had lost entire generations of young men struggled to maintain traditions and knowledge that had been passed down for centuries. Craftsmen who might have taught their skills to apprentices lay buried in military cemeteries, taking their expertise to the grave. Languages and dialects spoken by small communities began to disappear when their native speakers failed to return from the front. And so we reach the end of our journey through the Great War, that cataclysmic conflict that transformed not just maps and borders, but the very soul of human civilization. From the dusty streets of Sarajevo, where a single gunshot shattered the old world, to the railway car in Compiègne, where exhausted diplomats signed papers that would reshape the globe, we've witnessed humanity's capacity for both breathtaking destruction and remarkable resilience. The numbers tell part of the story. 17 million dead, entire empires erased from existence, economies shattered beyond recognition. But statistics can never capture the full weight of what occurred between 1914 and 1918. This was the war that taught humanity what industrial killing looked like, that showed us how quickly civilization's veneer could be stripped away by poison gas and machine gun fire. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Great War is not how it ended, but how those who survived it found the strength to rebuild. From the ashes of 4 collapsed empires, new nations emerged. From the horror of the trenches came medical advances that would save millions of lives. From the necessity of total war came technologies that would revolutionize peacetime existence. The men and women who lived through those 4 years of hell carried its lessons forward, determined that such suffering should never be repeated. They didn't always succeed in that noble goal, but their efforts to build something better from the ruins of the old world remain one of history's most inspiring testaments to human perseverance. Thanks for joining me on this exploration of history's most transformative conflict. If this deep dive into the past resonated with you, consider subscribing for more journeys through the moments that shaped our world. And let me know in the comments what aspect of the Great War you found most compelling. Until next time, remember that understanding our past remains the key to navigating our future.